So I promised 8 different teachings from today's Torah reading, and they're all relevant. Every one of them is relevant to today. They're not old ideas that were relevant then. I think they might even be more relevant now that we've had thousands of years to develop these ideas than they might have even been back then. Back then, people might have looked at them and said, what are they talking about? We're way more primitive than that. Like, why so sophisticated? That's how I actually feel when you look at some of the ideas and you understand their intention. You say, either in its time it was applicable for them and it's applicable for us, or in its time they might have looked at it too and said, how esoteric? Why? Why not just be simple? So follow along. The first thing I want to look at in shul life. Well, you know that we are planning on reopening, as are many institutions. We're just going to do it safely, and we're going to do it in a way that will probably displease many people, because there will still be people who can't come, or the conditions for returning currently are rather onerous. I mean, you have to ultimately commit yourself to 2 things: being safe in the shul environment and signing a waiver and giving away your rights for putting yourself in a closed space, which is fair, because you don't have to be here, and I have to, you don't, but we want to make sure that if you do come, you're safe. We will likely have some reopening, perhaps Armenian, where there can be true social distancing. We're perhaps going to, well, we're certainly working on having B'nai Mitzvah here, so it's just families, but even so, it's a long, long list of conditions for which people have to commit, and people are committed because the experience that they have here is worth it. And I'm encouraging people to have their celebrations right here as opposed to in a backyard or somewhere else, because I feel that this is the spiritual home. This is a place where inspiration has been delivered and received. This is a place in which we are warm and we are friendly, and it's ideal for us that the reopening of our shul comes with B'nai Mitzvah, with young people who will be the future, who will look back upon these days many, many years hence and talk about their resilience and their courage and their strength. We want it to happen here safely. Of course, for those of you who are contemplating that, we can broadcast it, we can make it look this good, we can do the overhead, we can do whatever you want. We can make it meaningful not only in person, but for all those who are watching wherever they are around the world, connected to you. It will be like here as much as possible. So yes, reopening is in the cards. You'll start to see a lot of organizations reopening. Some have no choice because their business model depends on in-person entirely. We don't want to be 4 walls. We want to be a congregation. We want to be together. We want to be a shul. And we're going to do it safely, but absolutely, yes, we're working towards it. High holidays are coming. You know, it's going to be Rosh Chodesh this week, the new month of Elul, the month of Ani Lidodi V'Dodi Li, I am to my beloved as my beloved is to me. The idea that there's a spiritual closeness during these months. You may not feel it because of pandemic, but the fact is that we believe that at the end of the summer, there's an intimacy that happens as we return to our everyday lives, which we reconnect to other things beyond family, friends, and leisure. In this month, it means we're 4 weeks away from the high holidays. Many, many, many of you have rejoined us. And those of you who have not, I will be in touch with you. I truly hope that you're coming back. And more than that, I hope that if you can afford it, you do. And if you can't, we'll take care of you. We've done so for quite a few already, and we're happy and delighted and overjoyed to be able to celebrate together with you, not only your successes, but even your challenges. We want to be there and make them better. Not every shul that you go to can say that. They can't all say that we want to celebrate your challenges with you, but we do. And if it's just a matter of money, well, we're lucky. We have generous people in our community, in our congregation, who have made it easy to not worry about the high holidays. Shortly, we'll be sending out information about what high holidays look like, how guest tickets work. We'll be sending all that information. Do not worry, high holidays will be entirely online. There will be opportunities for engagement with the Living Jewishly stream. There will be children's programming. There's lots and lots of stuff happening. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. Well, I can't promise you won't be disappointed. I can promise that we will do our best to make sure it's a great high holidays despite the distance. I want it to feel like we are there. Having said that, I want to thank Marty and Shirley Glick for sponsoring our live stream. Their generosity started way back with the high holidays, and they kept it going, and they are keeping it going for all of us to enjoy and all of you. And if any of you would like to assist in sponsoring the high holidays, please do so. Marty and Shirley have stepped up again and generously, but it's not a cheap endeavor to produce extraordinary quality content for high holidays. And if you're in that position, this is a moment we're more than happy to have you honor somebody that you care about, do it in memory or in consideration of somebody else. Tell me what I can do so that it's something that you're interested in, and I'd really, really appreciate that. It's a simple appeal for a sponsorship, but the impact of this sponsorship is extraordinary. It's a once-in-a-lifetime moment because you really are conveying the beauty of our tradition and high holidays to people who otherwise would have nothing. There is some news coming out about shofar blowing in the city of Toronto. I don't want to comment on it too early, but I believe that there will be an opportunity to listen to live shofar blowing. Remember, it's only on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, not the first. The first day is Shabbat. I don't know what Reform congregations or others will do on the first day. I don't know what everybody's plan is. Some people may choose to blow. I find that hard to imagine, so I think it's only the second day. The second day of Rosh Hashanah, there will be shofar blowing probably in various public locations. They probably will not be disclosed. You'll probably have to register to find out where they are and so on. I don't know what's going to happen with our synagogue. I've had offers from members to blow shofar. This may be your opportunity to assist us. I will be in touch and let you know. So, in our portion, we're listening to Moses talk to a people, a young people. It's mostly a millennial crowd. Their parents have mostly died. They left Egypt. The generation that left Egypt is nowhere to be found, except for many of the women were actually still alive, but the men were not. And it's a whole new world, and Moses is trying to convey to them stories about their identity, about their unique bond to history, about who they are, what they've been through. You know, it's only been 40 years, but still, 40 years is a very long time. Think about how much effort went into memorializing and remembering the Holocaust and taking care of survivors and those who perished. It's a lot of work to remember the big stories. 40 years on, people are starting to forget the impact. They're starting to forget the impact of the Yom Kippur War. They're starting to forget the impact, certainly, of independence for Israel. It's hard to remember. It really is. That was 40 years. Think about 9/11, how we thought about it all nonstop for years, and now it slowly dissipates. Over time, even the biggest stories fade. But Moses is trying to sort of reignite a connection to history. And here's the 8 ideas he shares with the people in a very short span. In these 2 chapters that we read today, this is what we come across. I'm beginning in chapter 13. If you want to follow along, it's chapter 13 in Parsha Re'eh. And Parsha Re'eh is a collage of many different ideas and stories. And here that's actually chapter 12, verse 29, which is just before 13. And it talks about how when you arrive in the land, and the land has been emptied of those of the previous inhabitants, and in this case, it doesn't say who wipes them out. It says, you shall expel them, live in their land. After they've been wiped out before you, be very careful not to fall into a deadly trap by trying to follow them. Do not try to find out about their gods, saying, how did they worship their gods? Because it will take you astray from your God. The Torah and Moses at this point is very obsessed with idolatry. The idea that there's one God, follow your God, don't follow other gods. Now, I have a theory about that, but the most important thing I want to talk about is this ingenious idea that Moses is suggesting within the text. And here's how it goes. When you arrive in a land, whether you've pushed out its inhabitants or you have not pushed out its inhabitants, whether the inhabitants abandoned it, but primarily, if you expelled the inhabitants, think of the Americans going to the west and wiping out the Native Americans or moving them into reservations. And that happened everywhere in the world. And we know that there's an entire conversation to be had about Israel and the previous inhabitants, but not for here, not for now. It's for experts, not for feelings. When you expel a people from your land, even as much as you start over again and take it over and make it yours, so to speak, you change the street signs, you take down their symbols, you put up yours, you put up your flag, you take down theirs, you get rid of certain things that remind you of history, and boom, next thing you know, it looks like your civilization. Moses is trying to suggest to people that there's a spiritual haunting, that land and space itself have a spirituality that calls to its inhabitants, and when the inhabitants live there long enough, it exists. And even if you get rid of the people, you can't get rid of the feeling or the sensation. And if you want to do some research on this, just look up the song lines of the Aboriginals in Australia and what song lines are, and how they use the shape of the terrain and the topography to not only tell stories, but also to sing songs that, if you understand what those songs are about, you can actually find a physical piece of land through understanding the song. It directs you to a shape, a place, but it also means you understand and you know the land. Inhabitants of a land don't just layer spirituality on. Sometimes spirituality comes from within the space, and when you excise them, when you get rid of them, when you throw them out or you move them, it doesn't mean that the spiritual draw disappears. And Moses is afraid that the people will be drawn out of curiosity. What was their spiritual dimension that they gleaned from their space? The spirituality of the valley, spirituality of the mountaintop, the spirituality of the river, the spirituality of the trees, of the view. These things they last forever. The view could be the same today as it was 5,000 years ago. There's a draw that Moses is afraid of. It would draw people away from the spiritual connection to the Torah and his teachings to the spiritual connection of those who lived in the land before. This idea about spirituality, it's not about the haunting in the negative sense, that there's a spirit that comes to cause mayhem. It's about the space itself emanates spirituality, and those who can feel it are attracted or curious. It's no different than the echo chamber that you can find in some valleys where you can hear your own voice from a distance. You speak, and then moments later it comes back to you. There's something there, and just because the people are gone doesn't mean the spirit is gone. Idea number one. Idea number two. Moses is telling them a lot of laws and a lot of rules, and it says in chapter 13, it is enough, just listen to this is so important. It is enough that you carefully observe everything that I am prescribing to you. Do not add to it, and don't subtract. Well, Moses is actually telling them that he is not conveying to them a little bit that turns into a lot. It's like I talked about earlier about the maximum of religion versus the minimum of religion, Moses versus Micah. The idea that the maximum of religion is the fullness of it. You don't need to add. And I know one of the greatest challenges we have as human beings, especially in the Jewish community, is that there are always people who want to add. We saw this with Passover, with stringency, with rules upon rules, that there's an obsession, it's almost a human desire to be restrictive, as though somehow the God that they don't know, the God that they don't see, the God they can't communicate with, the God that they claim left them a doctrine, wants more. And Moses says, no more required. None. But also not less. You can't cleave off the parts you don't like and get rid of. And this is the challenge, and this is the dichotomy of being part of a Jewish people or part of the people who understand the essence of the Torah, which is it's a system. You can't have one without the other. You can't have a four-way stop sign and not put up stop signs all four ways. If it's four ways, every way has to have a stop sign. You can't pick and choose the little bits. Now, what are those bits and pick and choose? Well, someone like me would tell you, no, it's not an absurd obsession with the details. It's an absurd obsession with the meaning of the details. Okay, fair enough. This is a long conversation, but what you'll notice now is that Moses is trying to restrain the impulse to add, to be more, or to be less. If you don't have to be more, you also don't have to be less. You could find a way to live within your mission and your purpose and your system. And that's what Moses is trying to convey. There's no more. Whatever you know, you know. Whatever you don't know, don't worry about it. It's all here. Which is quite a brilliant idea, that religion does not ask the individual to make it up or feel it or imagine it. It's all written. It's all present. Anyone can access it. It's open source. Which is really interesting, because when we get on to the next part of the portion, in lesson number 3, we come across Moses' corollary to that conversation, which is false prophets. So Moses has just said, don't add and don't delete. But if someone comes along and acts like a prophet and says, I am a prophet of the Lord, God has commanded thus, so and so, from now on you do this, from now on you do that, from now on you change this, from now on you change that, don't believe him. And Moses says, don't believe him because it's a test. It's just God's way of testing you. It's like the story of Rabbi Meir and Bruria. Look it up in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir, his wife Bruria, and the test, and how that went badly. But that was a test whether there was true love and fidelity. It's a very fascinating story about Bruria and Rabbi Meir. And while you're at it, you might want to do the research about when they lost their children and how they responded. It was just one of those stories, and Rabbi Meir was particularly a fascinating character in the Talmud. It's worth your time if you have interest in researching that. So here's Moses says, don't listen to the false prophet. They're just testing you. Don't trust them. Get rid of them. Of course, there's a death penalty. Of course, as I've talked, our duty as a society is to look at things and say, keep, change, adjust. Don't, not less or more, modify. The death penalty for many of us is inconceivable at this point. In those days, that was obvious. Bi'arta hara mikirbecha means you expel the evil from in your midst. In ancient times, the way in which you got rid of evil was death. If an individual was evil, they were killed. They left society. They were gone. You don't have to tolerate evil in your society. We have a different view, and that's our credit. We're allowed to evolve. It's still within a system. But here's the interesting thing. Moses makes the strongest argument about not listening to false prophets in this way. He says, that prophet or dreamer must be put to death for having spoken rebelliously against God, your Lord. You ready? Moses making an argument here. Who brought you out of Egypt and liberated you from the place of slavery. And this prophet was trying to make you leave the path that God has commanded you, in which to walk. You must destroy such evil from your midst. Why is it so important to Moses to say that you don't listen to that prophet because you were once slaves in Egypt and you know the right way? And the answer is, and this is very modern and also very ancient, the answer is that no prophet comes to tell you that everything is going to be better and sticks around to watch it happen. You can't deliver on that promise. You cannot deliver on a service that says, Some of you here are going to win the lottery. You're going to win the lottery. You're going to win the lottery. And you can't prove it. You cannot prove the promises you make. It's happenstance. It's random. Religion always tries to take credit for the good and always blames the bad on God, right? And when it comes to delivering on promises, the easiest thing for a false prophet to do is tell you what is changed for worse, not for better, because better is hard to deliver on. Worse is always easy. Anyone who predicted a pandemic in the next 20 years is right, but no one can predict the good. So prophets generally predict the bad. You may argue with me and say prophets also come and predict good. Well, some of the Jewish prophets certainly predicted good. Now, some of them predicted terrible things. Jeremiah predicted horrible destruction in the book of Lamentations for Jerusalem. It all came true. Was he a prophet? Was he imagining it? But generally speaking, prophets do not come and tell you good news that happens immediately because it's very hard to deliver. If you think about that, if you think about whether prophets come and deliver good or bad news, there's a reason that Moses links that to slavery, and that is because generally speaking, false prophets are coming to enslave you, to cultify, to seduce, and take out of society individuals who are vulnerable so they can do their bidding. There's a long, long, long list of false prophets, and they're not just about religion. They're about Y2K. They're about cults. They're about underground movements. They're about conspiracies. They're about all kinds of things. And today, I don't need to tell you, the false prophet of today is spending a lot of time talking about masks. Now, here's the thing about masks. I'm not going to get into the conversation of anything to do with the medical aspect of it, but the primary argument for not wearing a mask in public spaces, it infringes on my rights. The government is trying to subjugate the people, oppress them. Some people are claiming for some down the road, revolution or whatever the government is thinking, the government, which is us, ultimately. But the reason we're wearing masks is it's reducing our freedom. And we refuse to have our freedom reduced, therefore we will not wear masks. And that's why Moses speaks about slavery. When a prophet shows up and tries to enslave people, to enslave you by giving you new laws and new requirements and new restrictions and new demands and telling you that God wants this and God wants that, you are being enslaved. That's real enslavement. Wearing a mask in public spaces is not real enslavement. There are exceptions, of course. They should all be managed. Everyone should have the right to have their case heard. It's all fine. We can all figure it out. But what we need to understand is when we're constantly bombarded with ideas that we are being enslaved, we're being microchipped, we're being this, we're being that, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't know. What I do know is that's not real slavery. I do not feel my rights are infringed because I have an app on my phone that may help someone else find out if they've been exposed to COVID. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't. That is not slavery, my friends. Real slavery is when someone comes and in the name of God demands behavior, money, your children, your family, your loyalty for evil. That is real slavery. So Moses links the false prophet to slavery, so we as a people will always know the difference between real slavery and imagined slavery. It is not enslavement to wear a mask, but it is slavery to be asked to sacrifice your children for war. Number 3, or 4. The idea of false prophets to Moses was that people would be too engaged with a conversation about what God wants and what God doesn't want. Moses ultimately asked that people spend time with people, not with God. God's words were spoken, the commandments, whatever that story means, however that divine revelation happens, we end up with a doctrine. Our job is to work it, but it's to do it with people, not spending our time obsessed with God, the nuances of God, the alternatives to God, God, more God than anyone knows how to handle. And ultimately what happens is you end up spending your life focused on the esoteric, unable to convey all the goodness of humanity one to another. It's all about God, which is unknown, unseen, unavailable, unheard, unspoken. Moses wants people to spend time with people. By the way, that was Moses' greatest flaw, was that he was unable to spend time with people, with his family, with children, with people. He had a very short horizon of contact with people, and it was very uncomfortable for him. He failed in his relationships, so that's why Moses understood the essence of communicating with people. The fifth concept, in a very short little reading, comes from the continuation of the conversation about false prophets. What happens if you find out that an entire city has been corrupted? And an entire city, which means an entire chunk of civilization, is now announcing itself to be following a new God. Not the God of the Torah, not the God of Moses, not the God who took them out of Egypt. They've actually bought into a new form of slavery. They've adopted a new enslavement called new prophecy, whatever it is. What do you do with that town? This is an extreme story. And there are many reasons why it won't happen. But the Torah teaches it to us as an archetype. The idea is that if evil exists in a large scale, you have to eradicate evil in a large scale. How you do it? Ancient times, you go and you slaughter them. But even that, the people of Israel rejected almost immediately. Think of the story of Saul and Agag. He was asked to massacre the entire people. He just couldn't do it. There already was a shift in this idea that eradication of evil has to be with death. But nevertheless, that's the story we find ourselves in. And one of the last lines that we find in this story about eradicating this entire town of evil, it says, "Let nothing that has been declared taboo there remain in your hands." And verse 18 in chapter 13. So it's 13, verse 18. "God will then have mercy on you and reverse any display of anger that might have existed." Well, that's really interesting. God will have mercy on you, but you have not been merciful. If you look at the Hebrew text, it says, so that Laman Yeshuv Adonai Mecharon Apo v'nasan lecha rachamim v'richamcha. God should give you mercy or be merciful to you, v'richamcha. The word v'richamcha means God will be merciful to you. What does it mean, v'natan lecha rachamim? God will give you mercy and be merciful to you. Why do we need mercy? What is this, a gift of mercy? And God is merciful? It's a very interesting play on words that it duplicates the idea of receiving mercy and being the benefactors of God's mercy. And I think I heard this teaching from my father. When you have the capacity to slaughter people for evil, you've lost your capacity for mercy. You don't have it anymore. You need to have it restored. So you need two things now. As a killer, you need to learn to be merciful again. You might have put that aside for war, for many reasons. You might have to put that aside. But once it's over, you need your mercy restored. Otherwise, you're just a killer. You've lost the boundary between life and death for another human being. You need to restore rachamim. You need to have your merciful capacity restored. You also need mercy because it does come back to haunt the individual. I don't need to tell you the shameful, destructive, and we're still feeling the results of it today, the shameful and destructive lack of compassion and welcome to the returning soldiers of the Vietnam War, the most loathed war in American history, and when they returned, nobody cared. It was almost as if it was their fault that they carried out their duty to their country. It took years and years for those veterans to fight for the acknowledgement that they suffered, that they went through horrors just like everyone else. And the greatest horror that they went through was that they had to commit the horror. They were the masters of atrocity, and when they came home, instead of the country saying, "Thank you for doing our bidding, we were wrong," or that war was ended prematurely because it was useless, it was the film The Fog of War, it was false, it was a government construct. We asked you to turn yourselves from children into killers. Now it's your problem. You're a killer. We don't have to care about you. Come home to America, but you're a killer, don't forget. And that's the way they were seen, and that's the way they felt, and the post-traumatic stress disorder has never left that generation. And that is where the idea of v'natan lecha rachamim v'richamcha, if you were asked in the name of God to kill, well then you need to be restored to mercy. And then be merciful. When those soldiers came back, they should have been treated with respect, with dignity. They should have been debriefed. They should have been given mental health care. They should have been given financial care. So many of them were lost because of the mental health damage done because it was a society that didn't restore their mercy and was not merciful. So the story of Moses talking about killing out an entire people is that his warning to them is, remember, if the path of justice you wish to pursue to eradicate evil is annihilation, you will lose your mercy and you may not have mercy. And who's going to restore it for you? And that is why I believe from there forward the Jewish people refused to carry out orders in which they had to annihilate. So much so that I would contend, not just me, that the reason that they did not take Jerusalem by force was because it was owned by the Yevusim, the Jebusites. They negotiated an agreement with them. They bought it, they owned it, and the Jebusites were still allowed to leave there. They refused to eradicate them. Unlike the first entry to the land with Joshua, in which there was whole-scale eradication. All this comes out of the subversive nature of the conversation in which Moses on one hand can say, slaughter them, at the same time with a huge note, by the way, that will turn you into killers. You probably don't want that. And leave them both as truths for people to decide. Another short idea is, it's a couple verses. It says, when someone dies, don't mutilate yourselves. Don't make a bald patch in the middle of your head. I don't know what the ancient ritual was, but it was a cutting, bloodletting, shaving. There's a very interesting, subtle idea in the Torah which constantly refers to the idea of the human body being beautiful just the way it is. And I'm not discussing tattoos here. I'm talking about people who mutilate themselves, and there's many, many forms of mutilation for attention-seeking behavior. There's so much about this. I don't need to get into it, but I just want you to hear this lesson from the Torah that is part of Jewish thought, ancient Jewish thought, and that is the human body, the way it is beautiful. There are augmentations that are permitted, augmentations that are not, but the whole idea is that it's a de facto statement that you do not need to consider the image of God in which you're created imperfect. There is a conversation to be had about circumcision, about tattoos, about surgery. There's all kinds of things, but fundamentally, beautiful just the way you are. Subverted by the fact that priests could not serve if they were blemished. But that's the dialectic tension you have in the Torah with Moses, where he'll say one thing and say another, and they're both equally true, but it gives room for us as a people to evolve over the years and become what we think we really want to be. And we've obviously chosen to move away from the harshness and towards the compassion. The eighth teaching, well, seventh in this case, seventh, is bad news. Really bad news for the Jewish people. The bad news is pork is still forbidden. This week's portion. Don't eat it. Don't touch it. Don't own it. Sorry, guys. What can you do? Right here. Don't take away. Don't add. Bacon, no problem. Bacon, So that's a long conversation. Not for now. Maybe one day over Kiddush, we'll talk about it. And now, the last teaching is so fascinating to me from a monetary perspective, from a financial system perspective. If you have maaser, so every year you have your gardens and your fruit orchards and you're growing olives and you're doing wheat and whatever you're doing in your territory, 10% of that has to go to support the Levitical tribe. The Levitical tribe were the Kohanim, the priests, the scribes. They served in the temple. They took care of Jewish life. They were the administrators of the Jewish people. It was basically a form of tax paid to a spiritual bureaucracy that lived on the temple, in the temple era, the temple mount, in the temple zone. And they took care of Jewish life. They managed the holidays at the temple, they managed the sacrifices, they managed the courts, they managed the king's study facilities. They did all kinds of things. And in order to support them, because they did not get land, they were given cities and they were given tithes. You had to tithe to give it away to the Levite. And the Levites depended on the good nature of their constituents, which is really an interesting idea, because you know how in Canada judges are appointed, which I think is a much better system, and they're appointed by a group of peers. In the US, you're elected often as a judge, or, certain levels you're appointed, but as local judges, sheriffs, a lot of lawmakers are voted in, which obviously means that justice in some places is tuned in to what's local as opposed to the sweep of history. You may not find people to be utterly progressive, or you may find people to be entirely progressive, depending on where they're elected. They have to appease their constituency. And it may not be wrong, it's just likely to be based on the election. Some people might get elected once, have no aspiration to be elected twice, do whatever they can while in office, and never run again. Some people want longevity. So the question of what is just often depends on what is local. The Levites obviously had to be in some way engaged with the people positively, or else they would not have received their tithe. Because the tithe could have been given to any Levite. Yes, the one in your local tithe, but if people didn't like one of them, if you were rude, if you were crude, if you were difficult, if you misbehaved, well, the people would stop giving you food. So clearly it was a way of making sure the Levites didn't abuse their power, and it was an opportunity for people to vote on whether the Levites were effective. So what happens if let's say you have a significant operation and you take tithe, you give it to the Levite. What if the Levite is not present? Moreover, what if you've dedicated some of it to sacred purposes and you can't use it all at once? Like, let's say you had a bumper crop. You had a huge crop of olives. You made a lot of money. You wanted to give the olives away because they're sacred, but you can't. There's no one to give it to. It's a bumper crop. Everyone has olives that year. So what do you do? What do you do with that 10%? What do you do? So there's 10% that you go give to the Levites, and there's 10% that goes to you for sacred purposes. And what do you do with that? You convert it. You sell the olives, put it in cash, leave it in the bank, and when you have time, and when you have leisure, and when you have the opportunity, you take it to a sacred place and you enjoy it. think about what Moses is teaching the people. And this is so important for all of us, especially in a year where many of us have given up vacations and given up the opportunity to travel. We've literally tithed of our lives to save money or not spend money to go and do things, but we can't. So these objects, fruits, vegetables, animals, are not usable right now. There's too much, or we can't use it, or we're too busy. You sell it. Take the money, put it away, and later, in the fall, let's say, after your harvest, you take a trip. Take that money, go spend it on all kinds of good things with your family. You eat whatever your heart desires. You live properly. Just because it's sacred does not mean the object is sacred. They're not holy olives. You can convert those olives into cash. That cash is sacred, which means it's saved, it's put away, it's dedicated. This interesting concept Moses is teaching people is that sacred is not in the object, it's in the context, which is extraordinary because it is so easy to create holy olives and a holy cow and holy fruit, and the fruit is sacred. And part of that is true in Jewish life. You can't use it for different purposes, but if you sell it, some people would say that's vulgar. Turning sacred olives into cash? No, there's nothing wrong with money. It's what you do with it. It's how you do it. It's how you respect yourselves and your time and your family, that you don't rush to press those olives when you don't have time. Do what you need to do. And when you're ready, you have it sitting and waiting for you to enjoy. It's not the object that's sacred, it's the context. The object creates the context, but then you have to engage in those special and unique moments. Needless to say, in the times that we live, everything I've said today, I think, is relevant. Everything. And this is 1.5 chapters of Torah, and there's probably not a religious thought among it. It's primarily human. This is what's extraordinary and keeps me coming back, is there's so much to learn, even in little bits. Just remember, Moses speaks not out of two sides of his mouth, but literally two narratives that exist contradictorily, side by side, deliberately, because we have to find our space in the middle. And remember, it's not objects that are sacred, it's context. And context always involves people that we love. The emphasis now, as we go back into school opening, shul opening, let's not lose the closeness we've built during this time of pandemic. Let's maximize it. Let's find ways to make our human experiences most meaningful. Like Moses would tell you, don't do more, don't do less. Keep doing what you're doing, because right now we're learning about what's important and what's not. On that note, I wish you all health and wealth and Shabbat Shalom and an end to this pandemic as soon as possible. Amen. We'll be back in a moment.